This would normally be the time when I say, let's turn our Bibles to, and then whatever the passage it would be. But I'm going to start off with a couple of passages from Genesis, but you don't need to turn to them. I'll have them up here on the screen. And I think it would be safe to say that the events of the past several days have hampered the Mideast peace process. I think that would be, relatively an understatement as we take a look at the current events. And because of that, because of the gravity of what's been going on since a week ago yesterday, I thought it'd be best to forego my typical very witty and outrageously funny opening joke that I usually start with. So I'm just going to kind of pass that today and go right into the message. And in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and verses 7, God says to Abram, the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you." And then down in verse 7, it says, "And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land." And there he, Abram, built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. And then if we go to the next chapter, chapter 13, verse 15, God says, "For all the land which you see I will give to you and to your descendants forever." And the land that's being mentioned here has become known as the land of Israel, or as they say in Hebrew, Eretz Yisrael. And so, first of all, as we take a look at this morning, and I'm going to try to make it, it's not just simply going to be a history lesson. We're going to have a lot of application with it as well. But I'd like for us to examine what it means for the Lord to give the land of Israel to the Jewish people forever. Okay? It all began back during the Canaanite conquest, after they crossed over, the children of Israel left Egypt, wandered around for 40 years, crossed over the Jordan, and as they entered into the land of Canaan and began that conquest, about 1400 BC-ish, that was when the fulfillment of this land began. But it came to a very abrupt end in 606 BC with the fall of Jerusalem at the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And with a relatively brief exception, there was a period of time, about 2 centuries before Christ's birth, with relatively little exception, it is essentially, there has been no autonomous rule in that land until May 14th, 1948. So from 606 BC until 1948, there was no nation of Israel, okay? And I'm a timeline kind of guy, and so if we just look at a timeline for a few minutes. In the second century, in the first half of the second century, there had been a series of revolts that had taken place in Israel by the Jews against the Roman Empire. The most well-known one is the one that ended in 70 AD with the fall of Jerusalem, when Titus Vespasian sacked the city and destroyed the temple. But then, fast forward from then until the second century, in the 130s AD, there was what's known as the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that was when Emperor Hadrian was fed up with these cranky little Jews that were all the time causing problems. And so he destroyed the people. He won the battle, drove them all out of the land, salted the land so it wouldn't grow anything, and then renamed it in the Latin name of Palestina, which was the Latin name for the historical enemies of the Philistines, and just seeing that as a final slap in the face of the Jewish people, and then drove them out of the land in they were dispersed throughout the Roman Empire in what became known as, in the Latin, the diaspora. And for the next approximately 1800 years, the Jews were, for the most part, driven throughout the Roman Empire and throughout the world. They were without a homeland, and yet managed to maintain, for almost 2 millennia, they maintained an unbroken heritage and culture and ethnicity that has been unsurpassed. In fact, there has been no other people group in the history of mankind that has even come close to that. While they didn't have any nation that has been dispersed loses its national identity within a generation or two. They maintained their ethnicity and their identity for almost 2,000 years. From the mid, and this is important, I'm going to make several things that I want you to take note of, because your eyes might get kind of glassy-eyed at some point, and you just think, this is too much info. I'll point out when there's not too much info, okay, when there's something that is really noteworthy. And this statement is really noteworthy. Islam began in the early part of the 7th century AD. And from the mid-7th century, with the first Islamic presence in Israel, around the middle of the 600s, until the post-World War II era, there was never, and if you're taking notes, underline the word never, there was never, ever an attempt to establish an Arab homeland in Palestine. I'll repeat that. From the mid-7th century AD until post-World War II, there was never, ever an attempt to establish an Arab homeland in the land of Canaan, or what was named by Hadrian, the land of Palestine. Nor was there ever, and this would be point number 2 to underline, nor was there ever any ethnic group known as Palestinian. There was the inhabitants of the land were called Palestinians, but there was no ethnic group that was called Palestinian. You understand the difference? If you lived in the land of Palestine, you were called a Palestinian, mattered not what your ethnicity was. Jewish people lived in the land, and they were called Palestinians. But there was no ethnic group that went by that name. And starting in the middle part of the second millennium, the Turkish Ottoman Empire rose to power, and they ruled for about 400 years, including the land of Canaan during that time period. And here's a map showing the extent of the Ottoman Empire. It was a major empire for almost 4 centuries. And it was Turkey. You see Turkey up there, and if you look on a Bible map, it's called Asia Minor, but today it's called Turkey. And this was the Turkish rule over pretty much what was the Roman Empire before, only more so without the addition of Europe. And I've been asked a lot in the past week, and even before, but just a lot in the last week, if I think God is moving the chess pieces around on the board in preparation for wrapping things up. That's been a very common question that has come to me this week, and I would say yes. I would agree with that statement. But I would also say, as we're going to see that it was a process that he began almost 200 years ago. This moving around of the chess pieces so that he can wrap things up. And we have a tendency of kind of viewing things through our lens, through our time and space, because of that, we kind of lose sight of the fact that God doesn't view things that way. And so we tend to kind of view things on our time frame and not God's. But God's in no hurry, and he doesn't play competition chess. There's no time clock on it, and he takes his time. And he sees things on a much grander scale than what we will. And he's not motivated by our impatience, by the way. But the modern Zionist movement, if we could call it that, that's usually what the historians say, had its beginnings in the first half of the 19th century, about 200 years ago. And it was the first time, in 1844, it was the first time the Jews became a majority of the population in Jerusalem for the first time in almost 1,700 years. Think about that. There have always been Jews living in Jerusalem, but they had been a minority until just due to migration in 1844, the Jews ranked or out-populated in any other group. And in 1897, a guy by the name of Theodor Herzl held the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, and the Zionist movement was under full swing. Now, if we could fast forward from there to World War I, so let's just go fast forward a couple of decades to World War II, or World War I, which was from 1914 to 1918. And remember, there was the Ottoman Empire it was Muslim, but it wasn't Arab. Okay, they were Muslim by religion, but they were Turkish by ethnicity. They were Turks, the Ottoman Turks. They ruled all of this part of the world, the whole perimeter of the Mediterranean on down into Saudi Arabia and all of North Africa. And the Arabs during World War I, the Arabs of the area allied with the Britons to overthrow the Turks. Excuse me. And I don't know if you noticed, but a lot of Muslims don't get along. And the Arab Muslims allied themselves with Great Britain during World War I with the Axis powers, or the Central powers, the Axis powers, whereas the Ottomans were aligned with the Axis powers of Germany and Eastern Europe. And there was a Brit by the name of T.E. Lawrence that had been sent from Great Britain over into the Middle East to kind of rally the Arabs in the war effort against the Ottomans. And he just happened to look an awful lot like Peter O'Toole. And if you're under 40, you probably have to ask somebody who Peter O'Toole was. But he was he looked like a very blue-eyed Arab guy. And it was from the movie Lawrence of Arabia. This is that Lawrence. And he hooked up with a guy that looked an awful lot like Omar Sharif, who played the role in Lawrence of Arabia. He played the role of the sheriff of Mecca. And the two of these guys became pretty good buddies, and they did a really good job of getting the Arabs to unite, all the various Arab groups to unite against the Ottomans. And most of the movie and most of the history even, I think, was pretty much, because most of what we know about that time period, we know from him. Lawrence tells us, and so it was probably somewhat exaggerated. He was kind of he liked his picture in the paper, kind of a thing. But they got the job done. And also at that time, especially there were a lot of Jewish guys that were helping Britain in the war effort, especially not only in the Middle East, but especially in Great Britain. And so as a result of trying to the Arabs were rewarded by overthrowing the Ottomans, so that got their thing did, and the Jews were rewarded by what became known as the Balfour Declaration, and that's how they got their job did. There was a guy by the name of the British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour. Balfour wrote this declaration to a guy by the name of Lord Rothschild, who was obviously a person of royalty with a name like that. And in it, and this became an official document of the British Empire, the Balfour Declaration, and in it he called for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And this was done in 1917, so the war wasn't even quite over yet when the Balfour Declaration was established. With the fall of the Ottomans, that left a huge power vacuum in the Middle East, because they were the nation. They were the country, and all of a sudden they don't exist, and so you got all these various groups. They were predominantly Arab, but they were different flavors of Arab, if you can understand what I mean by that. And so there was this big power vacuum, and as the saying goes, to the victor go the spoils. Well, the victor here was Great Britain, and so they took control of the Middle East. And as they were trying to sort this out, they issued the Mandate for Palestine. And Churchill, who was the British Foreign Secretary at the time, issued this what became known as Churchill's White Paper in 1922. And in it, he was still calling to honor the Balfour Declaration, because, that was official British policy, but he was under a lot of pressure from the Arabs in the area, And so he somewhat toned it down some, and in it the original white paper of 1922, he said that it would be they were going to limit Jewish immigration to the area. So they were going to limit Jewish immigration, and that the Arabs, if they did carve out of this British mandate, this area here that you see on the map, this red area, if there was going to be an area that would be given over to the Jews for a homeland, the Arabs that were in that area would not be forced to become Israeli citizens or Jewish citizens, whatever the name of the country. The name of the country wasn't established at that point. But they weren't going to be forced into what Churchill called a Jewish nationality. Now, of this land that was known as the British Mandate, of this land, 80% of it was set aside. There were a period of during the 20s and 30s, there were a series of about 10 more white papers, and in that they decided that 80% of this British Mandate would be set aside for the Arabs, and it would be known as Transjordan. That would be the name of this area, because it was on the other. Transjordan means across the Jordan, and since they were east of the Jordan River, the name of that country was going to be Transjordan. And then the rest of the white papers was just kind of going back and forth of what they were going to do with the other 20%. And who was going to occupy that, and would they be autonomous, and what would it be called, and all that sort of a thing. This is going on all the way up to World War II. And this would be a point of underlining number 2. This was the original two-state solution. 80% would be Arab, and 20% would be Jews. And considering the population was relatively, it wasn't 80-20. It was there were more Jews living in the area at that time than that. That was a fairly equitable solution. And today you hear a lot of talk about this two-state solution. This was the original two-state solution. And it would be the area that would give the Arabs the most area that they would ever have. And today we know it from that area, to have most of the homeland that they would have for themselves. Keep in mind that this was before Jordan was a nation. There was no country of Jordan, just like there was no country of Israel. This was just the vacuum of the Ottoman Empire. And so what was then called Transjordan was later shortened to just Jordan. And that was the original area that they had set aside for the Arabs to have as a nation and a homeland. All the Arabs in this that were outside of the Transjordan area, in other words, all the Arabs that lived on the west side of the Jordan River, immediately, that would be the blue area of the map, they rejected the white papers, and they began riots and pogroms all the way around what's today Israel, even at that time period. And for the Arabs that are living in the West Bank and Gaza today, we're going to talk about that more in a minute, so if you're completely unfamiliar with the demographics, we'll come to that. But for the Arabs that are living on the West Bank and Gaza today, claiming that they want a homeland, keep in mind that their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers were actually given one 70 plus years ago. And the Kingdom of Jordan, which is what's that red area today is called the Kingdom of Jordan, they were given that as a homeland then, and yet it was refused by their forebears. They wouldn't accept that. They wanted all of it, which I think leads us up to today's situation. Now, following World War II, and the issue of repatriation of the land by the Jewish people became a hot button subject once again. beginning with the UN, they established the UN after World War II, and so the UN doing what they do, they formed a committee, and so according to the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, they adopted a, that was only supposed to do, that part right there, no more. No, okay. Okay, we got both parts. So they took that area of the Transjordan area, the UN did, and they partitioned it into two relatively equal parts. The blue being that was set, which was set. You can see it's kind of irregular. It doesn't make a whole lot. It was done according to demographics only. So where the majority of the area was populated by Jewish people, they gave them the blue part, and the part that was primarily populated by the Arabs, they gave them the green part. Okay, and thinking that way nobody gets displaced, and so it made practical sense in that way, but it was. It's kind of hard to have a country that's in 3 or 4 different pieces. But the Jews accepted it. The Arabs did not. And we'll see that's the case from that time forward. It had been that case from that time backward. One of the very few friends, and again, riots and clashes began breaking out in this area between... They had no country. I mean, the Arabs that lived in the country, the Jews that lived in that country were primarily immigrants that had snuck into the nation illegally, because immigration into that area was illegal under the British mandate, and even up to and including post-World War II period. And so they had to sneak into the country illegally and start being farmers. And the Arabs that lived in that area were shepherds and farmers. I mean, they weren't armies, but these two groups began having clashes between the Arab irregulars, is what they're called, and the Jewish underground, because they weren't even supposed to be there legally. And one of the few friends that the Jews had during this time period was a guy by the name of Harry S. Truman. And and in this partitioning, then Jerusalem was going to be set aside as an international zone that would be controlled by the UN, which that worked out real well. And so one of the few friends that they had at that time period was Harry Truman, and listen to what he said in his memoirs. The question of Palestine as a Jewish homeland goes back to the solemn promise that has been made to them, meaning the Jews, by the British in the Balfour Declaration of 1917. A promise which has stirred the hopes and the dreams of these oppressed people. This promise, I felt, should be kept, just as all promises made by responsible, civilized governments should be kept. And so by April of 1948, so this is a couple years after the war, by April of 1948, the public favor started kind of turning on the favorometer, started turning over to the Jewish side of things. And on May 14th, independence was declared. The Jewish people declared statehood. And here's a map of the land that was held by Israel on May 15th. It's pretty similar if you look at a map today and carve out the West Bank and Gaza. It's pretty similar to what they have today. Not quite as much, but pretty similar. And over the next 75 years, the Lord is going to perform tremendously miraculous things in the conflict of the establishment of the Jewish homeland. I mean, unbelievably, the Lord has been involved in that, most of which has been lost on the primarily secular Jewish mind. The nation of Israel today is primarily a secular nation, just like the United States is primarily a secular nation. And they will grow over time as they win battle after battle over overwhelming odds. They start beginning to think that it's due to their own prowess, their own military strength or technology or their own fortitude. And but keep in mind that this is only God's way of moving pieces around on the chessboard. He's putting all this into play. So they declare statehood on May 14th, 1948. Immediately, 4 Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, and Syria, declare war on this brand new 24-hour-old state. And they started advancing against them. Israel didn't have an army. They didn't have any weaponry. These Arab nations were all financed pretty much by Russia and had the latest Russian technology. And the Israelis suffered huge initial casualties, and Jerusalem was cut off at one point. But they were able, and they were running out of supplies, and they didn't have first aid or food or anything like that. But they were able to establish a supply line, and the fighting ceased in 48. When they brought the Arabs says, okay, uncle, but they refused to sign a peace treaty. There has never been a peace treaty signed between the Arabs, the Arab people. A couple of these nations have, but the Arab people have never signed a peace treaty with Israel. And so the UN stepped in, as the UN likes to do, and they established what is known as the UN Green Line. And so here is a map, kind of pretty much of that area that was controlled by Israel at statehood, but then the UN came in and they said, yes, we'll put a stamp of approval pretty much on those same borders. And it was known as the Arab Greenland, or the Green Line. And so the nation of Israel was established. Now there was a number of skirmishes. There was a war between Israel and Egypt in the mid-50s, between 56 and 57. It was primarily over Sinai, sometimes called the Sinai Campaign. And following that campaign, there were several moves to unify the Arabs, all these various Arab nations. There have been several moves to try to unify them. Those nations were trying to unify the Arabs that were living in living in Israel. After the Sinai campaign, there were several different attempts to try to get the Jews living in the new nation of Israel under some kind of identity, other than just the fact that they were Arabs living in Israel. And that all ended with a guy by the name of Yasser Arafat. I forgot this part. 76, a little over 750,000 Arab refugees or exiles during World War II, or during the War for Independence. Almost a little over 750,000 Arab refugees or exiles. In other words, these were Arab people that were living in that area that was claimed by Israel at statehood. There was, and so they left that area and they went in primarily to either Lebanon on the north or Jordan across the Jordan River to the Transjordan side, the newly established nation of Jordan. There were an equal number of Jews that did the same thing, that were living in primarily Lebanon and Jordan. They left those areas either by being kicked out or just by running for their lives, and they ran into the area of Israel. Equal number, and that's kind of important to understand. But after this campaign of 56 to 57, they started trying to unify the Arabs in that area, and they ended up with, the Arabs called that defeat of this whole thing the Nakba, which is the great disaster. And after several years of trying to unify the Arabs, a guy by the name of Yasser Arafat became the leader and was later named as chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, which was the group that the Arabs living in the West Bank and Gaza all became kind of semi-united under the PLO. And it wasn't, on the surface, on their PR releases, it was so that they could have a national identity within the nation of Israel. They wanted the West Bank and Israel and West Bank and Gaza to be recognized as the homeland for the Palestinian Arabs. But in reality, that's what the newspaper headlines said. That's what their press releases said. But in reality, they just wanted Israel to not be there at all. And Yasser Arafat became the leader over this group. And then that happened during the 60s, and then in 1967 we come to what's called the Six-Day the 1967 Six-Day War. Here's an example of Cairo Radio, which was the Egyptian state sponsored radio station. Here's a broadcast that they did on May 16th, 1967. The existence of Israel has continued too long. We welcome the battle that we've long awaited. The peak hour has come. The battle has come in which we shall destroy Israel. King Hussein of Jordan, on the 30th of May, said this: "The armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon are posed on the borders of Israel to face the challenge, while standing behind us are the armies of Iraq, Algeria, Kuwait, Sudan, and the whole Arab nation," meaning Saudi Arabia. "This act will astound the world. Today, they will know that the Arabs are arranged for battle. The critical hour has arrived. We have reached the stage of serious action and not declarations." So that was May 30th, King Hussein. The next day, the Iraqi president, Rahman Arif, said this: "This is our opportunity to wipe out the ignominy which has been with us since 1948, the year that they declared statehood. Our goal is clear: to wipe Israel off the map." So it was clear to Israel that war was imminent, and they decided that they had to be proactive. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the country's only been around less than 20 years at this point. Their military is, the military equipment that they have is primarily composed of World War II retreads. The only Air Force they have is some French Mirage first-generation jet fighters, 25 or 15-year-old jet fighters from France. And this is all they had, you know. And so they decided they had to be proactive, though. And so on June 5th, Israel and Egypt had this state-of-the-art Air Force that was furnished by the USSR of MiG fighters and I mean, probably the best Air Force in the area of all the Middle East. And so on May 5th, Israel's Mirage French fighters caught the Egyptians flat-footed and took out over 400 planes while they were still on the tarmac, effectively cutting the Egypt Air Force off at the jugular. And immediately Jordan and Syria retaliated. That was on June 5th. On June 10th, they called for a ceasefire. Here's a map of Israel on June 5th, the day that they proactively went into Egypt and took out their Egyptian fighter planes while they were still on the ground. This is the border of Israel on June 5th, 1967. This is a map of the land of Israel on June 10th, 1967, where they took the Golan Heights, which is an extremely strategic area between Israel and Syria, and Israel and Lebanon, for that matter. The West Bank, which was sometimes called Samaria, even in modern terms, Gaza, or Gaza Strip, as it was called back then, and the Sinai Peninsula. Israel offered after the war. They offered to return 90% of all the land that they took during the Six-Day War. And Egypt and Syria refused to negotiate with them. So there was no peace treaty signed. They just stopped fighting. And so they didn't want their land back, so Israel kept it. And by the fall of 1973, at this time, Israel is suffering from a tremendous dose of what we could call the Sansom syndrome. You know, just like, it doesn't matter, whatever they bring, I'll squash it, you know. And they weren't worried about anything. And so this time, Syria and Egypt acted proactively. And on Yom Kippur, 1973, they caught Israel kind of flat-footed. The Syrians took over the Golan, and the Egyptians came in through Sinai. And they caught Israel off guard. Israel suffered a lot of heavy casualties initially, but after about a month, they kind of collected themselves and started pushing back. And there were some ceasefires that were signed about a month after Yom Kippur, when the Syrians and the Syrians and the Egyptians saw that the war wasn't going their way, they signed a ceasefire. They never signed a peace treaty, but they did sign a ceasefire. And during the war, 2,700 Israeli soldiers died, and 8,500 Arab soldiers died during the Yom Kippur War of 73. The result of it, even though Israel won the war, they kind of lost the PR war, and because Saudi Arabia blamed Israel for all of this, and that's what led to the very famous, or we could say the infamous, oil embargo of the mid-late 70s, was the Yom Kippur War. And so the oil prices tripled, long lines at the gas pumps and everything. Jimmy Carter was president, and people were calling for his head, and this was all due to that. And it also led to a whole series of anti-Israeli resolutions by the UN. We fast forward to 1979, Carter, in an attempt to try to establish his legacy when people were wanting to oust him. He was able to broker some peace negotiations between Anwar Sadat, who was the head of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, who was the head of Israel. And he got them all together, and Jimmy Carter was famous by saying, here we got three religions, all serving the same God, and we're going to hold hands and make nice. He ended up in 1979, Egypt, Anwar Sadat signed a peace treaty with Israel, first of the Arab nations to do so. They signed a peace treaty with Israel, which led to later his assassination, but he signed a peace treaty with Israel. And since then, there have been a whole number of intifadas, which means it's when a mullah or a emir or some Muslim cleric will call for an intifada. It means uprising or rebellion. There have been a whole series of those in the Middle East. Too many to count. It depends on 5 or 6, depending upon how you categorize them. In the first half of the 90s, when Clinton was president, he was negotiating in 93 and 94. He was negotiating a peace deal between the Palestinians and Israel in what's known as the Oslo Accords. And this was all done off the books. No, it was supposed to be a super secret thing in Oslo. And they signed the PLO, and they signed this thing known as the Oslo Accords. And in it, the Palestinian Liberation Organization became the Palestinian National Authority, or the PA. The PLO became the PA, which meant that they were given a lot of autonomy. Before, the Gaza and the West Bank were all under Israeli control. But as a result of the Oslo Accords, then they were given a certain degree. It was kind of like, you guys need to earn your autonomy, but we're going to give it to you as long as you make nice. And then Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel in 1994. Both of those peace treaties, Egypt and Jordan, still exist to today. But a lot of suicide bombings and attacks, that's when all that started getting, there was a whole bunch of that going on back then. A lot of different intifadas were raised, and there were a lot of attacks on settlers that were all Israeli settlers that were in direct violation of the Oslo Accords. But the Arabs living in that area were doing so because they didn't want this peace deal that their leaders had received. And today, Arabs living within the nation of Israel have full Arabic citizenship. They can vote in elections. There's at least 8 members of the Israeli parliament known as the Knesset. There's at least 8 members of the Knesset that are Arab. They have more rights. This is an underlining point. They have more rights. The Arabs living in Israel have more rights than the Arabs living in any other Arabic state, or any Arabic state. The Arabs living in Israel have more rights than any Arabs living in any other country in the Middle East. The Palestinians have rejected virtually every peace accord that's been offered to them and broken the ones that they did accept. They were offered statehood in 1948 and 2000, both of which they rejected, because they don't want statehood. They want the eradication of Israel, as we saw in those earlier quotes. In fact, they've responded by those offers with armed aggression and terrorist attacks. And my question would be, if we go back to the the Palestinian mandate, most of the Palestinians, which would be considered an Arab living in Palestine and under the Palestinian mandate, most of the Palestinians live in Jordan. Why don't they ever call for intifadas there? They're still living in refugee camps. 70 years later, they're still living in refugee camps. Why don't they call for uprisings there? But they don't. They only call for them in the land of Egypt, or Israel. Today, officially, the Palestinian Authorization has control and oversight over the Palestinian Authority, has control over the West Bank and Gaza, officially. The West Bank is semi-autonomous under the leadership of President Mahmoud Abbas, who is the legal president of the PA. And he rules over the West Bank. And Israel gives them a lot of autonomy, not total, but a lot of autonomy. The Gaza, however, is under the leadership of the Hamas chairman. You've heard a lot about Hamas in the last week. The chairman of the Hamas is a guy by the name of Ismail Haniyeh, and they've had pretty much autonomy. Israel hasn't had anything to do inside the borders of Gaza since 2005. They've given them complete autonomy, and under the leadership of the PA and Hamas, conditions have gotten from bad to worse under their leadership. These two dudes here, with respect to their political parties, they don't get along. I know it's kind of hard to understand two political parties. It's hard for our American minds to wrap our brains around two political parties fighting. But these guys don't get along. And so the West Bank is governed by the political party known as Fatah, and the Gaza is governed by the political party of Hamas. It's even though it's not registered as, it is recognized as a terrorist organization. It's also a political party that the inhabitants of Gaza voted for. They voted for Hamas to be their leaders. So in a free and fair election, as free and fair as an election could be there, they chose Hamas. In addition to all of this mind-numbing craziness, there are couple of other terrorist groups that I think is important for us to understand. There's Hezbollah, which is headquartered in southern Lebanon, which is where the Lebanese refugees from Palestine went to. The Arab, during statehood, the ones that fled to the north went to Lebanon, and Lebanese government immediately put them in refugee camps, which still exist today. And that's where Hezbollah, Iranian-backed Hezbollah, has their headquarters. That's where they operate out of. And then the other terrorist group is known as the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is technically in Gaza, but they do a lot of stuff in the West Bank as well. And they're under the leadership of the first one is under the leadership of the Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, and the second one is under Secretary General Zayed al-Nahla. Here's what the Hamas charter states, which is the ruling party in Gaza. Israel would exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it has obliterated others before it. So the goal hasn't changed. That's still what they want to do. In fact, the guy, the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, he said this. He said, the Jews are a cancer which is liable to spread again at any moment. He said, there's no solution to the conflict except with the disappearance of Israel. If they all gather in Israel, it will save us the trouble of going after them worldwide. That's what the head of Hezbollah said. And I'm sure all these guys that I've mentioned are hardworking dudes, the leaders. I'm sure they are. And to, a workman is worthy of his wages. I hope I don't come off as judging the leaders' motives in this. But it looks like these guys got some pretty good gigs. Yasser Arafat, at his death back in the early aughts, he died of a stroke or heart attack, I forget. He was worth over $1 billion at his death. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the PA, is worth over $100 million. Hassan Nasrallah is the general secretary of Hezbollah, is worth $1.5 million. And the guy that you probably never heard of, Ismail Haniyeh, the general secretary of Hamas, is worth $5 million. And these guys say that they are only concerned about the plight of the Palestinian people. And I would say, if so, then do something about it. Stop brainwashing your children from infancy to grow up thinking that the best way that they can please their God is to kill a Jew, and to if you want to really please him, do so in a very slow and painful way. Get over this whole great Satan, little Satan thing, and start working for the good of your people instead of the good of your bank accounts. That's what I'd say to these guys. I mean, there is no question that this piece of real estate on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean belongs to Israel. Yeah, but they took it by war, someone will say. Even if that were the whole story, and it's not, but even if that were the whole story, what nation hasn't? Can you name a nation that hasn't? In fact, they took it from the people who took it from the people who took it from the people who took it from the people. I mean, that's been the history of mankind since the book of Genesis. Has Israel been the best landlords in the last 75 years? Maybe not. But then again, what nation has been? Do we want to start virtue signaling right now as Americans? The way we've run the United States in the last 225, almost 50 years? Ezekiel 11:17 says, "Therefore say, thus says the Lord God, I will gather you from the peoples, assemble you from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel." This wasn't talking about Abraham 4,000 years ago. This was talking eschatologically as we start looking at the end times clock that I believe began 200 years ago. God gave this land to the Jews forever, period. Okay? Here's the thing. This would be the point to underline, what is that, number 5? Here's the thing. Both sides of this conflict ain't got Jesus. Okay? Both sides of this conflict need Jesus. Every day there are people dying on both sides of this conflict or going into eternity without Jesus. And so at what point do we let that truth rise up to the top and allow it to trump our politics and change the way we view all this? I mean, yeah, it belongs to Israel. I get that, and I am an Israel supporter. Have you seen my office? I got an Israel flag in my office. We get all kinds of Israel stuff up here. I dig the nation of Israel. They are God's chosen people, but they're not walking with God. He's using all of this. He's working all this stuff out, and he's assigning the chess pieces around so that he can reveal himself to the Jews. And if the Jews think that what's happened in the last week or the last 75, 80 years is something, they ain't seen nothing yet. And that breaks my heart of what it's going to take for them to realize that Jesus is their Messiah. But they will. It's just... Jews, I've got a lot of Jewish friends. And they will be the first to agree. Them some hard-headed people. And it's going to be really hard for them to come to the place where they will have to acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah. But they will. And yes, Jesus is on the throne. He's totally in charge. And so my takeaway in that is, how, Lord, do you want me to pray for what's going on over there right now? What is my role as a Christian removed thousands of miles away with limited resources. What can I do but pray? And how would you have me pray? You know, many people have asked me too, and I'm going to wrap it up with this, but many people have asked me whether or not these current events fit into the end times scenario. You know, I've been asked that for a number of years, but just especially in the last week. And I to that I would say, of course. I mean, yeah. But then, you know, those who follow what I would call the headline eschatologists, you know, the ones that, not against them. Some of my friends are headline eschatologists. Some of my best friends are. But they kind of interpret eschatology by the latest headline. And those who do so will fit any current event into an end time scenario, right? And so, you know, yeah, okay, so there's that. But this, the last, what are we, in the 8th day of it now? This feels like an end time scenario. And by that, I'm not talking about, you know, some sort of touchy-feely, liver quiver 9/11 kind of end times eschatology, because we all thought 9/11 felt like that, and that was a long time ago, and it did, and it was, but God's timetable is not like our timetable. I think it feels, it's got the vibe of end times all over it. Russia and Iran have never been closer. There's no Islamic nation with a greater hatred of Israel than Iran. The Middle Eastern nations, non-Israeli Middle Eastern nations fomenting over Israel is on a level of 11 out of 10 right now. I mean, you know, after 9/11, you never saw nations around the world chanting and having marches in favor of Al-Qaeda. And there have been a lot of, you know, this is Israel's 9/11. And there have been marches all over in major cities in the United States supporting the Palestinians, supporting Hamas, supporting what happened a week ago last Saturday when babies were beheaded. The Middle Eastern nations are bent on the eradication of Israel. But I don't think any nation will gain more from that kind of fomenting than Russia will, than Putin will right now. He digs this. Not only does it turn attention away from Ukraine, but this is going to result in some great oil hikes. And you know, they're an oil-producing nation, and so they are going to love the price of gas if this continues. So much of this, I think, has this lace up your rapture shoes kind of vibe about it. But then, and I've said but then quite a bit, but then again, this is but then part 3. So did the events of 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago and 4 weeks ago. I mean, I've had my shoes laced up for 4 decades now. And you know, one of these weeks, one of these days, one of these hours is going to be the hour. And it's going to be the minute. And no minute in all the history of the world has been better than this one for the rapture. And so our job as Christians who are looking for the Lord, our job is, as Jesus tells us in Luke 21, verse 28, now when you see these things begin to happen, look up and lift up your heads because your redemption draws near. Not anything for us to lose sleep over. It's something to be excited about. You know, I grieve over the loss of life. I would like it to end, but I know it's only the beginning. One way or the other. But it's all in God's plan. He's still in charge. He's still on the throne. And his will is still going to be accomplished. Amen? God, we just thank you. Lord, we thank you for this. We bow our heads before you this morning in recognizing your absolute sovereignty. And God, we just pray for the peace of Jerusalem, understanding what that price is going to have to be paid for them to do that, for them to recognize the true peace that comes when the Prince of Peace rules. And so we long for that. And we pray that you would shift our hearts in that direction in preparation for that. In Jesus' name, amen.